2023 has been another eventful year for Africa. Elections, conflicts, climate change, rising cost of living and geopolitics all had an impact on the continent. Major world powers paid closer attention to Africa as the continent seems to take on a more important place in geopolitics. Conflicts continue to rage across the continent, with millions displaced and tragically thousands losing their lives. There were several coups that took place, creating a coup belt across West and Central Africa. Climate change and a rising cost of living also continued to hammer the continent during the past year. On this special edition of the program, we'll look back through some of the major events of 2023 and how they shaped the continent. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, joining me now to unpack the year that was for Africa are from Dubai, Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined; from Abuja in Nigeria, David Otto Endele, Director of the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies; and from Kampala, Joseph Ochieno, an African Affairs commentator. Welcome everyone to the program and thank you for joining in this discussion. I want to get your assessment first of all, because Africa entered 2023 with a long and urgent to-do list. Before we look at the specifics, I want to get your assessment and thoughts on the trends and events that you feel shaped Africa in 2023. Hannah, let's go first.
Well, of course, we know from on the ground, we felt inflation, we felt a whole range of different challenges. But in fact, if you look at the continent overall in comparison to the rest of the world, we had better growth than the rest of the world in 2023. So while, yes, we were having challenges in 2023, we have been doing a bit better. And my expectation is 2024, we can do even better and move on. But let's also hear what others have to say.
All right, Joseph, your thoughts?
The year comes to an end on the continent, quite clearly on a slightly better trajectory, generally, really economically, and generally also, you would say, politically. But on that, it's perhaps a draw. It's a draw in the sense that while we continue to recover generally from the post-COVID period, which is general across the continent, politically, the Sahel was a shock for the continent. And of course, the continuation of the situation in Sudan, and to an extent, you could say in DR Congo, which is the silent war which continues. But generally, of course, the better bit, of course, is part of the hosting of BRICS and the development of BRICS, and indeed the continent reasserting its authority, including the voices and languages that you could see how African leaders were responding to the situations, particularly in Russia and Ukraine. You could say that perhaps the continent is waking up, but I think we're still too far, really, from where we should be as a continent of 54 independent nations with a big voice, particularly the continent with the largest amount of material resources, and yet we're still struggling to find our feet.
Right. David?
You know, I buy into Hannah's view that compared to the rest of the world, you know, Africa fared well in terms of its economic growth. I mean, it has some of the fastest growing economies in the world, which of course is good news. But remember that, you know, the continent is still recovering relatively from the COVID-19 pandemic. But also, this is a continent that is still feeling the impact of the ongoing war in Ukraine. You know, of course, we have issues that are linked to conflict within the continent. If you look at the Sahel, for example. So I think, you know, from a security point of view, we are dealing with quite some issues. You know, of course, you know, we talk about coup d'etats that, you know, have become an issue, especially in the sub-Saharan African Sahel region. So yes, we've done well. We continue to do well from an economic point of view in relative comparison to other continents, but we're still, you know, facing challenges, you know, which of course, you know, we'll dive into in the course of the discussion. But I think we have a front foot, and that's why Africa has become a very key continent, you know, from a geopolitical standpoint.
Hannah, let me start off with that geopolitical standpoint, as several panelists have talked about the positives from Africa's perspective. Geopolitics, Hannah, and realignments remained a key focus, though, in 2023. How did Africa's relations with the West and the East evolve in 2023, and what geopolitical factors influenced these dynamics?
Well, if you remember, just at the end of 2022, we had the US-Africa Summit, and I think that paved the way for many U.S. leaders and officials visiting the continent to try to look at new projects. Similarly, on the other hand, China itself opened up, and we had 20 African heads of state and foreign ministers going to China to really look at the new relationship, take advantage of China's opening up. And again, also similarly, Chinese leaders also visited the continent, with Xi Jinping, for example, going to South Africa in August and hosting a Africa-China dialogue. So again, and European leaders as well, there was a global gateway. So there's been a lot of activity with development partners and many new projects announced. At the same time, there's still, many of these are still to get off the ground, as it were, and still have a lot more negotiation and discussion to get to moving and to really deliver the kind of growth that many African leaders, of course, would hope for from these kinds of discussions and projects.
Right. So, Joseph, I want to get your view here, because in terms of geopolitics, you know, the African Union joined the G20 group of economies. The IMF Executive Board gave Africa a third seat, and 2 other African countries joined and expanded BRICS, which you alluded to earlier. Joseph, so what does this mean, though, for multilateralism?
I think, as I said at the introduction, the BRICS thing is actually the big shock, shock in a positive way for the continent, but I think also shock for the other interests on the continent, particularly Global North. And Global North seeing what, as I said, the assertion that Africa is able to express, and with their partners, in this case, China and India, and to an extent, Russia. So I think that is a major one. But whatever it is the case, also that what happened in the Sahel and what's happening in the Sahel, including the most recent developments where Mali, Niger, and I think Burkina Faso are talking federation, while the rest of the world, and maybe even some of us observers, might say that, well, it is some tiny little simplistic game, you know, between those countries versus France and others. I think the import that African nation states, whatever the circumstances, these are military dictatorship that I don't necessarily support, whatever they are, they're able to take such kind of a position, means that I think, in my opinion, the continent will be looking in the next 5, we are looking at next 5 to 10 years, to a direction in which I think African leaders are able to assert themselves, and find that actually when they assert themselves, you know, it is also the case that the rest of the world will be listening. So that is actually, I think, very important. But also the other thing, as I said at the beginning, in the question of Russia, Ukraine, I am not quite sure whether our other friends in the West have settled with that. And then finally, of course, the unfortunate war going on in between Israel and Hamas. The fact that a number of African countries took positions, including a rather assertive position by South Africa, right, you know, has not gone quite unsilent. And I know many other Africans are now reviewing their relations with the rest of the world. And I think the net beneficiary at this stage would almost certainly be China going forward.
So, David, when we look back at what Joseph is alluding to, Africa's position now on the globe, would you say, David, that Africa will now play a more significant role in global governance moving forward?
I think so. Even though we shouldn't, put Africa as if it's a one, homogeneous continent. Of course, it is. But of course, different countries have different dynamics. I think the important point, which we all make, is that the continent as a whole is being seen as a very strategic and important player in global politics. But not just in global politics, but also in the global economy and trade. We have the potentials are there, without question. But I think what will be much more important is, how coordinated these individual countries are in terms of, strengthening their position and covering the gaps of the weaker states, to ensure that even though individual countries would talk on trade, but of course, we come in as a bloc. I think this is one of the areas where we still have some weaknesses in terms of how Africa works, as a bloc. But without that, we are seen as a big player, and that explains why we are now a permanent member of the G20. But that's a strategic point. Yes, we're a member, but what happens? This has to be, what we expect, to see from an operational point of view how we benefit from these situations. We have weaknesses, as we've all mentioned. We have challenges that exist within the continent, but we still remain a big player. But how do we harness that? Is what I think 2024 should be focused on. And God help us, that the African Union, should put on a seat belt for the entire continent, and let's go in as a bloc so that we can have the most, or we can reap the benefits that we do deserve as a continent. Right.
So Hannah, I want to get a very brief comment from you here on that, how Africa will position itself on the geopolitical map, both economically and politically, because there have been efforts by a growing number of countries to reduce the role of the US dollar, particularly in international trade. What is your take on that, Hannah, first? And what do you foresee going forward?
Yeah, I think we have to separate out the geopolitical from the economic, and it is very much an economic decision where countries are trying to reduce their reliance and dependency on one country or on one currency. There is an increasing understanding that being dependent on one source is really challenging. And for example, countries who might be having Eurobonds needing to be paid next year, for instance, they are the ones who are going to be facing the biggest challenges if they remain dependent. So especially coming out of COVID, I think this is a new sort of level of clarity around this. It's not geopolitical, but nevertheless, it is something which is important to African countries' growth and growth strategy. We have to diversify our partnerships, and part of being able to use different currencies for our trade. And in fact, vast majority of African countries, we trade primarily with the EU and China. That's where we spend our money. So why not use those currencies to be able to be able to transact, and also to use our own currencies to transact. So we've also seen a great deal of movement on the Pan-African system of payments, and I'm sure we'll see even more in 2024 on that.
All right. Thank you all very much for those insights. We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll continue with our look back at Africa 2023. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Hannah Ryder, David Oto-Endele, and Joseph Ochieno. On this special edition of the program, we take a look back at some of the events that shaped Africa in 2023. David, security had its own impact on Africa during the year. Instability and conflict manifesting across some regions. What are the major challenges, though, that Africa faced, and how were they addressed?
Well, I think, the most prominent one, was the reoccurrence of military coup d'etats, which has impacted on a lot of the democratic institutions. That has set back a lot of countries in the Sahel. But I think it's much more an indication of the fact that, we do not have to copy and paste, when it comes to a system of governance, because of course we do not have the, the maturity, the political maturity to maintain a democratic institution that, has independent arms of government. We have increasingly seen a situation where the constitution has been abused to a point where men in guns who are meant to protect the people, hugely protect, the government. And then, of course, that backfires, when they realize that the governments are no longer capable. So I think the issues of insecurity that we've seen in the continent, I've indicated that, Africa needs to move on. And to move on as a continent, we have to look at individual dynamics of what works within each country in the continent. And try and promote a government of the people. Now, it might not necessarily be called democracy, but I think what people require in the continent to progress to the point of economy where we want, or stability, is a government that is responsible, institutions that work, and a society which respects the human rights of its citizens.
So, David, we did see a wave of anti-French sentiment, though, that hit West African countries, creating also a coup belt across the Sahel. What is your understanding of the waning French influence in that part of the continent?
The countries in the Sahel, have realized. I mean, I'm talking about the likes of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, but also Guinea. Most of the French African countries have realized that they were getting the short end of the long stick, and their economic development was being smashed down. Kind of a knee on the neck, by the French. And I think what they've realized is that the stronghold that the French had on these. On the governments, of the day, was, an impediment to development. We've seen, how that has panned out. Now, we are not saying that, we're promoting coup d'etats, because, of course, we haven't seen any benefits of that as we speak. But what we're saying is that we're seeing indications of not just anti-French sentiment, but demonstrations of the colonial legacy that a lot of African countries are still recovering from. And I think, we are approaching a point in the history of Africa where people want to see independence not just in terms of the name, right, but independence in terms of system of governance, independence in terms of the economy, and independence in terms of how they choose friends and enemies, as a matter of diplomacy. So I hope that we would see some stability. And I hope that decisions in 2024 will be based on what the people want, rather than what the colonial or the pre-colonial or the post-colonial masters do want.
So, Joseph, aside from the issues in Central and West Africa and the Sahel, we're ending the year. Sudan, the DRC remain in turmoil. Are the conflicts in these countries now in danger of being forgotten by the global community?
You could argue that the global community forgot them long time ago on the one hand, but on the other, used them because the conflicts in both countries could be and will be traced predominantly from external forces out of the continent. But part of what is really lacking quite clearly, as I said at the beginning, is a question of leadership, and maybe some of the nuances are suggested by David on the question of the Sahel. I think this continent does not only need to wake up, but we also need to wake up and make sure that we stop blaming other people. There is a clear absence of leadership on the continent, where a situation in India, Congo, and a situation in the Sudan, for example, the two issues, become permanent matters on the tables of our African leaders, 54 of them across the continent, day in and day out, and simply say, brethren, we need to be able to deal with this. 60 years ago, around the time of the Lumumbas and the Botes of this time and the Nyeros of this world, no, these guys took a position and simply said no to apartheid, no to the occupation and exploitation of Namibia. And they ran with it. Granted, it took a very long time, right, but they ran with it day in and day out. Every young African child, including me when I was starting primary school, I knew there was an issue somewhere. No, the Sudan and the Congolese situation will only then be resolved when African leaders begin to make this as matters of national import. For the moment, I believe that unfortunately, many of our leaders have got so much interest in these issues, and in many cases, people don't want to talk about them. I think it's not necessarily about East-West. It is simply the case that we just genuinely do not have leaders, whether elected or not, who have the continent and the peoples at hand, meaning first and most important. It is simply the case that even in cases where there are civilian authorities, the basic services to our people are not being provided. And as I said, Congo and Sudan should not necessarily be matters for external forces on international community, but should really be matters of all African concern. So this should be agenda number one, I hope, at the AU summit on January the 1st next year in Addis Ababa.
Right. So I want to get a quick feel from all of you on the hits or the misses that you felt, Africa had in 2023. Hannah, let me start off with you here. Are there areas where you foresee significant growth or potential challenges for the continent in the new year?
Well, if I could also just add something on the security issue, because I think quite often we're also very much self-deprecating. We have to also remember that we did have one major peace agreement that was brokered in South Africa with regards to Ethiopia. And of course, there's still a lot more to do in Ethiopia, but that also took place in 2023. And so we need to also remember that we do have leaders who are trying to do their best to try and find solutions. And many of these manifestations of that, whether it be, military takeover, etc., in many cases, in fact, much of it is about trying to set a new path and a new economic path. And it's very difficult. We have a sort of chicken and egg question do you start with development or do you start with security? Do you start with security or do you start with development? And in many ways, we have to do both. But we've had the AU really focusing for many, many years on security. This year, the AU started to focus on economic issues with AfCFTA, really bringing that to the fore. And I think that is a bright spot. That and the agreement for the AU to become part of the G21, I call it now, I think will set the pace for what happens in 2024, because it is about really starting to shape the international order in our interest. And most of the time we think about what is China's interest, what is US's interest. It's time for us to think about what does the world order look out from our perspective? How do we shape it in that way? And I think being part of G21 will force us to do that, not only domestically, but also internationally.
Right. Joseph, what might Africa look like on the economic, security or geopolitical front in 2024?
I think economically, almost certainly we will be slightly better than we were this year ending. I know that we declined marginally, only just about marginally, but we did slightly better and we've been improving. So I think economically, the continent continues to be on the high and upper trajectory. Remember, as I said, we are the richest continent. All we need to do is basically rejiggle and reorganize the economies. In terms of security, I think, yes, that concern remains. Of course, as we know, in many cases, some of these are generally quite unpredictable. But how the Sahel pans out, particularly the first 6 months of next year, will possibly determine which way, what kind of conversation we're having. Let alone, as you rightly say, the question about DR Congo and Sudan. But beyond that, in the broader geopolitics, I think the continent will be looking slightly much more in a better position, talking with confidence. But I think that confidence and perhaps net benefit to the peoples will only be if there is a genuine democratic dividends in the native individual countries, regional blocks and organizations, and continentally. I hope that there will be more of the George Wares where people lose elections and they're able to at least voluntarily offer and give such fantastic messages of, the country is much more important than individuals or political parties and organizations.
Right. David, your predictions on what Africa might look like on the economic, security and geopolitical front in 2024?
Well, I think from a geopolitical standpoint, I think, what I want to see is African countries reasserting themselves. I don't want to see, African countries visiting one country. I mean, that country should come to Africa. I think that's what's very important, from a geopolitical standpoint. Economically, we have to focus on developing our agricultural sector. We have a youthful population that is uncomparable to any part of the world. So we need to make use of that, to assert our economic and geopolitical strength. From a security point of view, I think we've come to a point in the continent where we shouldn't be relying on other countries, to provide us, with our security solutions. We have the capacity and capabilities within the continent, our people, to devise our own security architecture, to deal with the various insecurities that we have in the continent. So I think, I want to see an Africa that, not just seen or heard as being the most important of the continent in the world, but, an Africa that is proactive. And the only way we can do that is if we have good leaders, who, are patriotic, we have good institutions, and then we can cooperate and coordinate. We have to develop an African wolf pack in terms of the way we approach the global world in 2024.
Right. So, Hannah, I'm going to give you the final parting shot for 2023 and your predictions for 2024.
Well, I think 2023 has been a year in which we have seen Africa rise. We will see more of that. And my hope for 2024 is that we will see much more focus by African leaders and development partners on industrialization, value addition, really negotiating very hard with all of our investors to make sure that they are not just investing in extractives or at the very simple scale type of manufacturing in our economies, but bringing the best so that we do reduce that dependency on the rest of the world and start to really become much more self-sufficient and also a stronger contributor to the rest of the world going forwards.
Right. So Joseph and David, my producers, insist that you must have a parting shot for 2023 as well. So Joseph, let me get your thought there.
Yes, I'm much more optimistic economically going forward next year. I just hope that the continent is able to invest substantially. The net infrastructure deficit that we have is nearly 100 billion US every year. I hope they're able to do that, but also hope the continent and the leaders are able to invest in the key services, particularly education and health. And when we do that, and I totally also agree, when we do that and then back it up with agriculture, for which we are the richest 60% in terms of endowment globally, there's no reason why next year should not be a year of hope and possibilities for all our peoples.
Right. David, your parting shot?
The African Union has been invited to be, a permanent member of the G20. That tells you a very, pertinent story. It tells you that this is a continent that is driving forward, and this is what we want to see. From a security point of view, I think, again, we have to push ahead an African solution that comes from Africans. We must not forget in 2024, which is upcoming, that the only people who can have their interest is the people that matter, and these are the African people. So we must come up with a security strategy in 2024. One, as the African Union, but two, as individual countries dealing with individual threats, to make sure that we do not rely on external partners. We collaborate, we coordinate with them, we share knowledge, experiences, but let it be African homegrown. From an economic point of view, this is a blessed land. And I believe that we must make good use not just of our human resources, but also of our natural resources that we have in the continent, as blessed as we are. Those are my predictions for 2024.
All right, and on that parting shot, we'll leave it there on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all my guests. Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, David Otto-Endeley, Director of the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, and Joseph Ochieno, an African Affairs commentator. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, have a happy new year, and we wish you a blessed and prosperous 2024. Goodbye for now.